I'm James Button, Communications Manager at the Grattan Institute. We're about to release a new report that looks at falling electricity demand in a time when electricity prices are still very high and the link between those two trends. I'm talking to Tony Wood, who's Energy Program Director at the Grattan Institute. Now, for every dollar we as householders spend on electricity, about 30 cents in that dollar goes to the generators, the people who make the electricity. But the highest component, about 45 cents in every dollar in our bill, goes to the companies that carry the electricity from the generator to the business or to the home. Now, demand is falling, but the costs that these network businesses, as they're called, impose on our power bill is staying very high. Why is that?
Well, it's a surprise to many people. Even the experts in the industry didn't anticipate this coming. Over the last 50, 60 years, since about the 1960s, energy consumption in Australia was going up steadily year after year after year. In the early 90s, we saw the beginnings of a change in the structure of the economy where we became less dependent on energy. A lot of energy-intensive manufacturing started to become less important to our economy. But even then, the growth in the economy continued to drive increases in energy consumption until about 2005-06, when things started to change and change reasonably quickly, and we saw energy demand on the east coast of Australia flatten and then start to decline for the first time ever. And in Western Australia, we're seeing the same trends occurring. So there's something seriously different going on in our energy system.
Now, why is this happening? You've spoken about changes in the economy, but there are other reasons as well, aren't there?
Well, at one level, market works. For example, prices have been high because of a range of reasons, and people are responding to those. So when we go and buy a new appliance, we're more likely now to buy a more energy efficient refrigerator. We're seeing the impact of new insulation. We're seeing the impact of LED lighting. Something like 20% of our energy, our electricity, is used up in lighting. So if people change from the old incandescent light globes or fluoros to these new LEDs, not only do they don't have to change the damn things every 6 months or so, but equally they also get a big difference in their electricity bill.
Here's the catch, Tony. Normally when demand falls for a product, prices fall. But that's not happening in this case, is it?
And the reason for this is somewhat complex. In most things, as you say, we buy and sell. If we buy less, the providers of those goods and services will initially charge less to try and keep up the sales of their goods and services. The network businesses, on the other hand, are really quite different. These businesses are natural monopolies. What happens is that we appoint an independent regulator to set the prices. So instead of competition setting the prices for these businesses, the regulator says, okay, in exchange for allowing you to operate as a monopoly, no competition, you don't have to take risks in the commercial sense, we will allow you a reasonable return on the assets that you've invested. That means that the regulator has to be very sure that the level of the assets being built by that company are appropriate, because what happens then is that the consumers end up paying. So the regulator sets the maximum revenue the business can earn on the assets, and once that's done, for the following 5 years, that company then gets an allowed return on those assets. So if the assets are more than we need, then the consumers pay for the extra assets. And so therefore, as demand falls, and we're actually using less assets, all those assets that have already been built are still being paid for.
What's the worst case scenario here? If this continues, this trend you've described, what might happen?
Well, some in the industry have described this as a death spiral. What they mean by that is that progressively, if demand continues to fall and prices rise, we're providing an increasing incentive for consumers who can afford it to actually get off the network. That means that the costs of supplying them will also have to be borne by the remaining consumers. So progressively, we have the same amount of assets being paid for by an increasingly smaller number of consumers. And eventually that just spirals downwards into a situation which is clearly untenable.
Okay, to stop the death spiral from happening, or even well before that, to stop prices staying so high, what do you think government needs to look at doing?
We would suggest there are 3 things the government needs to consider and begin to consider now before it gets much worse. The first thing is to try and make sure that the businesses are not over-investing in assets. That means 2 things in that respect. Firstly, try and make sure that the capital forecasts are better. The second step is to reform the tariffs. So instead of having a tariff structure that includes a volume component or a consumption component, we should move to a situation where the tariffs reflect the load that we as consumers put on the network. And that would be a far more fair system. It would make sure that we don't have people with big air conditioners or solar PV systems effectively freeloading. And the third thing we need to do is seriously think about what do we do with the assets that have already been overbuilt. This problem may even get worse in the future if demand continues to fall. In the competitive markets, businesses would ultimately have to write down or write off those assets. In this case, what do we do about those? At the moment, the consumer, as I said before, is paying for those assets. Is that the right thing? Is that fair? Or should someone else be seriously asked to pay for those assets now, effectively rip the band-aid off now, get the pain over and done with, and then move on? The question is, who is going to absolutely end up having to have or deal with that pain? Will it be governments? Will it be the shareholders in the companies? Or will it continue to be the consumers?
But if we don't have that pain now, we're going to have a lot more pain later on.
And that's the challenge. And this is a very difficult problem, never foreseen, and governments have to begin to come to grips with it now, because if they don't, it will only get worse.
Thank you, Tony Wood.